All right, everyone, good morning. I'm Natalie Kalin with the Kentucky Bankers Association, and I really appreciate all of you all being on here today. And I want to thank Dean Dorton, one of our valued associate members with the KBA, for sponsoring today's presentation and providing the speakers and providing all this great information for us. So I'm going to get ready and turn it over to them so that they can introduce themselves and start right on time. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. Good morning. My name is Guy Cozy. I'm the cybersecurity practice lead for Dean Dorton. We're proud to be a member of KBA, and we serve several of the members. Dean Dorton is a Kentucky-based tax, audit, and business consulting firm. About 250 employees, got offices in Louisville and Lexington, and a recent one in Raleigh, North Carolina. We've got a dedicated cybersecurity team here. And this morning with me, got two of my colleagues, Michael Gilliam, who is a cybersecurity services manager. And on the second presentation, we've got two presentations for you today. The second presentation is going to be led by Corey Shell, who is our senior cybersecurity consultant. So thanks for joining this morning. I am sharing some slides here. We've got two presentations for you. The first one is around continuous testing. We've talked to several of our clients, and more of them are moving forward with that model instead of having an IT audit test or security assessment once a year. Then they try to spread some of these activities for several reasons. So we're going to talk this morning about why it is important in your industry to think about that. So I'm going to start with a security incident example. The company in question is American Bank Systems. It is a service provider based out of Oklahoma, and I was looking at their website. It looks like they've been in business since 1969, and they are now providing specialized banking software to 350 banks, credit unions, and other financial institutions in 35 states. So that's a notice here that that is informing us that that organization has been victim of a cyber incident, systems being compromised, and it looks like the threat actors got hold of some of the organization's sensitive information. About 50 gigabytes of stolen information, to include data from financial institutions, access credentials, application source code, employee and customer data. So we'll keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. So what are today's trends and concerns from a cybersecurity perspective? So in order to look into that, we're often leveraging the Data Breach Investigations Report from Verizon. It is a free resource that you can download. They've been doing that report, I think, for about 13 or 14 years, and there's a lot of very useful information. They collect information on known security incidents and data breaches, and provide us with statistics on per industry, per incident types, so we can look at what happened and try to figure out what's coming. So if we look at the reported incidents by industry, and we look at all the incidents analyzed in 2020 by Verizon, so about 32,000. The finance industry comes kind of at a small number here, but I think it's a little bit misleading with the changing landscape. and you have to account for the third-party risk. Organizations that are working for the banks that are not labeled here as finance. So thinking about the ABS incident that I've just talked about, I think we have to think through the information industry, information services industry, and the professional industries. So if you're working with third-party vendors that have access to your systems or cloud-based services that you're using, they would definitely fall in these two categories here. So the low number of incidents reported, at least, by the financial industries can be a bit misleading. I think we need to expand that. So what are some of the commonalities between these different incidents? Of course, it's not shocking to see that most of these breaches were financially motivated. But what's interesting here is a high number of data breaches associated with web applications. And this year is about 43%. This number is way up compared to last year, and probably a trend to using more cloud-hosted platforms. It's also interesting to note that 37% of the breaches are because of stolen or used credentials. Sorry about that. So if we look at the main attack vectors, I don't think anybody on this call is going to be surprised. And we see the same thing when we help organizations that have been victims of security incident. The main attack vectors that we see are email phishing, credential compromise, and software vulnerabilities. And it could be a combination of these vectors from time to time. So I thought before we dive into the continuous testing model would be to go back and talk a little bit about ransomware. I think everybody knows an organization or somebody who's been victim of ransomware. And we've been talking about ransomware for several years, but that threat really is not one single malware, but a variety of different malware. And when I dived into the topic, I thought it was very interesting to understand how quickly that kind of threat has evolved over time. So we'll start from the beginning. The first ransomware virus was created by Harvard-trained evolutionary biologist Joseph Popp in 1989. Popp conducted the attack by distributing 20,000 floppy disks to aid researchers from 90 countries that attended the World Health Organization's AIDS conference in Stockholm. He claimed that the disks contained a program that analyzed an individual's risk of acquiring AIDS through a risk questionnaire. However, the disk contained a malware program that hid file directories, locked file names, and demanded victims to send $189 to a PO box in Panama if the victims wanted their data back. So this was referred as the AIDS Trojan and the PS Cyborg. It's interesting to note that the healthcare industry remains a popular target of ransomware attacks over 30 years after the AIDS Trojan. The next evolution of ransomware emerged after computing was transformed by internet in the early 2000s. One of the first examples of ransomware distributed online was the GP Coder Trojan. GP Coder was first discovered in 2005 and infected Windows systems and targeted files with a variety of extensions. Discovered files were copied in encrypted form, and then original files were deleted. The new encrypted files were unreadable, and the use of strong encryption dwarfed any attempts to unlock them. A message was displayed on the victim's home screen with information on how to pay the ransom and unlock the file. So that's kind of the early stage here. And then Bitcoin appeared. So, of course, many of you have heard about Bitcoin, especially in your industry, that decentralized cryptocurrency that first surfaced online in August 2008. Bitcoin empowered cyber criminals to make ransom demands for digital currency, removing the inclusion of a transaction form or traditional currency. Cyber criminals use Bitcoin because it's fast, reliable, and verifiable. The attacker can watch the public blockchain to determine if a victim paid, or even make a unique payment address for each victim and automate the process of unlocking the victim's file upon payment. Bitcoin became widely used in ransomware attacks in 2009. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Windows. These attacks really generated low financial returns at the time and were easily detected and removed by anti-malware software. Then going into 2011, we've got Locker. And that malware is considered the first widespread example of a Locker ransomware. The Locker prevents the ransomware victim from logging into their device, an entire system, instead of only encrypting the files. That first variant targeted the Windows operating systems and copied the product activation system, keeping the victims locked out until they purchase an activation key. The WinLock Trojan prompted users to call a toll-free number that ended up racking up a significant bill to the attackers after the call ended. The trend of imitating software to trick victims into paying with fake subscriptions evolved with the development of police ransomware. Attackers would deploy malware that would target infected systems with messages claiming to represent law enforcement agencies. Attackers informed victims that evidence related to criminal activities was discovered on the device and that it would remain locked until a fine was paid. Police ransomware was often customized to make attacks seem more authentic by displaying the victim's IP address or a live feed from their own camera. And CryptoLocker. This one surfaced in 2013 as a more aggressive and direct version of ransomware. CryptoLocker presented victims with two options: pay the ransom within 3 days, or all the files would be deleted. CryptoLocker represented the advancements cyber criminals reached in encryption. The programmers used command and control servers on the hidden Tor network and produced very strong encryption keys to infect the files with specified extensions. This acted as a dual protective measure. Individuals would be enabled to search for the public key as a base to decrypt the files, as it was hidden on the Tor network, while the private key held by the programmers was independently strong. CryptoLocker also innovated a new distribution method. Infection initially spread via the Game Over Zeus botnet, a network of infected zombie computers tasked with spreading malware throughout the internet. Therefore, CryptoLocker signified the first ransomware spread through the medium of infected websites. Successive ransomware adopted its CryptoLocker principle to replicate CryptoLocker's lucrative success. And it's worth noting that the United States Department of Justice seized the game over Zeus botnet in 2014, and it was dismantled at this time. Loki is one of the most dangerous examples of ransomware due to the expediency and scale of its infected computers. This was distributed via phishing attacks with malicious Microsoft Word attachments, and it infected up to 100,000 new systems every day at its peak performance. Loki also changed encrypted file names, making it very difficult to correctly restore the data. Then Key Ranger emerged as the first ransomware that targeted Mac Apple computer systems. It targeted the Mac files and the Mac's restore system, preventing the victim from restoring the system to a previous version. And WannaCry and Petya represent the first ransomware attacks that occurred on a widespread global scale. WannaCry is a crypto worm that semi-autonomously replicates and spreads. It marked a new phase in ransomware, as it was the first ransomware that spread via targeted vulnerabilities in computer. WannaCry attacked its first victim in Spain in May 2016. Within days, it infected 250,000 computers, representing the largest ransomware attack in history. Petya was another crypto worm that exploited the same Windows vulnerabilities as WannaCry, despite the targeted release of security patches by Microsoft to remedy the issue. Petya's success illustrates the urgency and necessity for patches in computer systems and environment. And ransomware as a service. GainCrab is the first example of this method here. It is spread via malicious emails where the victim is prompted to download a zip file containing the ransomware. Reveal ransomware, also known as Sodinokibi, was first discovered in Italy in May 2019 and is a known successor of GainCrab. It's a ransomware as a service model for distribution and employs anti-kill technology to avoid detection by anti-malware software. And it's spread at the time through Oracle WebLogic vulnerabilities, Flash UAF vulnerabilities, phishing emails, and open RDP ports. Getting to 2020. So we noted several initial infection vectors across multiple ransomware incidents, including RDP, phishing with a malicious link or attachment, and drive-by download of malware facilitating follow-up activities. RDP was more frequently observed in 2017 and declined in 2018 and 2019. We still see some organizations that are dealing with ransomware because of open RDP ports, by the way. These vectors demonstrate that ransomware can now enter victim environments but by a variety of means, not all of which require user interaction. The number of days elapsed between the first evidence of malicious activity and the deployment of ransomware range from 0 to 299 days, and that's according to FireEye report. If initial detections are detected, contained, and remediated quickly, the significant damage and cost associated with the ransomware infection could be avoided. So based on all that information that we've seen so far, ransomware is now used by organized criminals. They are leveraging powerful and automated hacking tools. There's this double extortion scheme where not only you have to pay or you're prompt to pay to decrypt your files, but also you're asked to pay so that your data doesn't end up published on the web like we've seen for ABS. And the attacks are becoming faster. It's extremely rapid. And then we've seen examples of entire networks being compromised within an hour. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing very quick, and then Michael Gilliam is going to take over here.
Good deal. So as Guy had mentioned, my name is Michael Gilliam. I'm a cybersecurity manager here at Dean Dorton. To kind of tie back in what Guy has gone through, I really like going through that historical timeline of the ransomware threat. You can kind of see it evolving over time and getting more, they're getting quicker, they're getting better processes, they're getting better tools in their entire, in their capabilities. So the same way that the threat actors are continuously evolving and getting better at their job, it kind of ties back into our topic here, which is getting better at our job, which is preparing for them. And some of that is in that testing. And that's how we prepare for these types of threats, is just, as it says there, testing, testing, testing. And to me, there's really three kind of main categories of testing that we do as organizations to help prepare our cybersecurity programs. At a high level, we have, let's see, didn't go. At a high level, we've got audits. Audits, one important thing to me to really distinguish the audits, they don't directly attempt to ascertain the security of a system. It's more of an indirect test, if you will. They're really designed to validate conformance to a particular standard. And those standards are usually designed to help facilitate security for a system, so it's more of an indirect test, but they don't necessarily directly validate the effectiveness of a security control or program. There's lots of different examples of what audits the standards that they can be designed to review. They can be compliance review that look at different regulatory standards. You could look at different security control frameworks. There's a lot of really good security control frameworks out there that are documented. So the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, 853, CIS has the critical security controls, ISO. And then lastly, another type of audit that we typically deal with and see a lot is configuration reviews. So those can be with the actual technical configuration of a particular system, whether it's, server and workstation baselines that are designed by either CIS or Microsoft Security. Another type of testing that we do to help prepare our security program, as I mentioned, audits are more of a conformance to a particular standard. Risk assessments are more designed as a thought exercise to help in the planning of what security controls you might need for a particular system. So the goal of a lot of risk assessments are really to ensure that the proper protections are in place for identified threats or threat actions, and to identify the overall risk for an asset and see if it's conformable with the pre-decided upon acceptable level of risk for that particular asset. I've got some description here on what a risk assessment can be. Risk assessments are a really broad category, and they can really take a lot of different shapes and forms. Typically, they're focused on specific assets, but they can also be focused on other particular items. But again, you're really trying to go through more of a thought exercise on identifying what controls might be needed to get a particular asset down to an acceptable risk level. And really the last area of type of testing that we do is technical assessments. And this is what I'd like to focus on talking about today, as I feel technical assessments are very, very important. The big difference between technical assessments and a lot of the audits and risk assessments that we might do is that technical assessments really focus on the effectiveness of the implemented controls, whether they're technical controls or processes that we have in place for our organization. A good example of a process might be, a patch management program. A technical assessment can provide us the information to help us determine the efficacy and the outcomes that we get from those particular processes and controls. And there's lots of different types of technical assessments. And in a lot of cases, we have to kind of step back and take a look at them and really try to ascertain what these different type of technical assessments do. There's a lot of confusion out there on the different approaches and the different scopes of the technical assessments that can be out there. So the first type of technical assessment I wanted to talk about was vulnerability scanning, which really at a high level, a vulnerability scan or a vulnerability assessment is just a technical assessment designed to yield as many vulnerabilities as possible in a particular environment. What you're looking for in a vulnerability assessment is for known software vulnerabilities or known configuration issues that can be identified. In addition to the vulnerabilities themselves, vulnerability scans they'll yield different types of information, the severity of a particular software vulnerability, and help you determine maybe a remediation priority. Vulnerability scans and vulnerability assessments are not designed to bypass security controls. This is something, again, that we'll do typically in our own internal security program to help determine the efficacy of our patch management program, and it also helps feed into our patch management program. So if we start to identify trends in different types of vulnerabilities that are coming out, we can trace those back to a root cause and help feed that information back to improve our patch management program. Vulnerability assessments are typically highly automated. There's a lot of scripts that'll be run. The tools will generate lots of information. One other thing that I like to mention about vulnerability scans is authenticated versus unauthenticated scans. So when you can do these types of assessments, you can either provide credentials for the vulnerability scanners to log into a system to generate information. Those typically yield a lot better results and a lot more accurate results than an unauthenticated vulnerability scan will. Unauthenticated vulnerability scans really just look at the asset that's being scanned from the outside. So what particular services are available. That could be, Samba services or any kind of ports that are open on the system, being able to vet it there. And if you think about that from a perspective of the type of information you will get, it's the same type of information that an unauthenticated attacker would get if they were trying to perform direct technical attacks against the system. As kind of Guy mentioned earlier in one of his slides, you look at the different types of main attack vectors that these ransomware folks are using. It's not direct technical attacks. They're not trying to directly exploit a particular service on a system to get ransomware on it. They're sending emails. They have websites. They've got links. They're using what we call kind of a client-side attack. So it requires user interaction and actions to be able to execute something on a system. So to get the information that tells you what vulnerabilities and what configuration issues there may be on a system that would be involved with those main attack vectors, you really need to provide authentication to determine, the configuration of the system from the inside, what software is available to the client on the inside that would be exploited through one of those emails or malicious websites. One other thing to note there, so a lot of times we think about vulnerability scans as, these tools that we run that reach out and touch systems and pull information from them. There's also a concept of a passive vulnerability scanner, as you can see in that screen. That's more of a concept of passively sitting back and monitoring network traffic and using signature-based detections to identify potentially vulnerable software or misconfigurations in an environment. So there's lots of different ways that you can conduct a vulnerability assessment and get vulnerabilities. The second type of test we typically hear a lot about when we're talking about technical assessments is a penetration test. And this is a term that is used a lot for a lot of different types of assessments. It is a very broad category, but I really like the way that the FFIEC IT handbook defines it. It defines a penetration test as any kind of assessment that subjects a system to a real-world attack or mimic a threat source's search for and exploitation of vulnerabilities. So depending on the scoping, this could include attempting to bypass organizational security controls. It could be exploiting vulnerabilities. It could be exploiting system weaknesses. And it could, and typically they use real-world tactics, tools, and procedures used by threat actors to achieve some kind of predefined goal. You may have heard this type of testing referred to as red teaming or adversarial threat emulation. The goal of this type of testing is not to identify all potential, vulnerabilities and security issues, which again, if you go back to the vulnerability scanning, that's more of the goal with that type of testing, is to identify as much information as we can about the weaknesses in our environment. The goal of the penetration test is not to do that. It is more to assess the effectiveness and the effectiveness of the implemented security controls, whether they're technical or administrative controls or organizational processes, but really designed to assess the effectiveness of those controls to prevent, detect, or respond to a threat actor or a threat action. I kind of like this graphic when we're talking about penetration tests, because it kind of shows you the breadth of what they could be considered. From a scoping perspective, you have a lot of different options. You can have completely what we consider like a black box assessment, so something from the outside, the external environment, and have a particular goal with that type of assessment. You can have internally focused penetration tests, so something that already has a foothold on the network and testing your internal controls in your environment. Penetration tests can be focused on very specific systems. If you have really critical systems that you have particular controls around inside of your environment, a really good example is if you have like a PCI environment, there's specific requirements around internal network access controls, internal authentication systems related to PCI systems. Conducting a penetration test can be scoped around just those particular areas of the network that you're concerned with. And then again, it can be targeting very specific systems. So one type of penetration test that you can have in your environment is just a web application penetration test that is really designed to look at the configuration of one particular web application. In addition to just the scoping options with it, there's different types of knowledge and access that you can have in different types of assessments. You've probably heard of these termed as, white box, gray box, and black box assessments. That really just, those terms are related to the amount of information that the attacker has about the environment when they're doing a test. So again, going back to our external assessment, a lot of times those are scoped as black box, with the attacker not having any knowledge about the environment, that they have to kind of gain that knowledge as they go through their reconnaissance process. They have no credentials, they have no access, and they're really relying on reconnaissance and open source intelligence to target the particular victim. Gray box assessments are kind of in between. You might have some knowledge about the environment. One particular scenario that I like to discuss with a lot of clients as a gray box assessment is, make the assumption that the attacker has breached your external perimeter and they have a foothold on the inside of the network. So they have maybe what we consider a compromised workstation. So they have maybe just some kind of piece of malware running at the user level on a system on the inside of the network. Taking a look at that type of gray box assessment to start testing internal controls to identify any kind of weaknesses on the inside. And then there's white box assessments. So those are really where you have a lot of knowledge about the environment. You have a lot of knowledge about the controls around a particular system, and then you're looking for vulnerabilities there. Additionally, one other thing to talk about with penetration tests that's different with vulnerability scans is goals. Penetration tests often should have some very specific objectives associated with them. Depending on the type of test, those goals will vary greatly. They could be as simple as, gaining a foothold on the internal network from the outside. They could be as simple as, gaining a particular level of privilege inside of an environment or an application, or it could be gaining access to a particular set of data that has specific controls around it inside the environment. But depending on the goal, scope, and knowledge, penetration tests they can vary greatly in what they look like. The last type of test that I wanted to talk about was a term called purple teaming. So purple teaming is really kind of a combination of a lot of the penetration testing, also working with what they consider blue teaming. So you might have heard me earlier referring to penetration testing as red teaming. Any type of internal security operations that your organization might have is often considered blue team. So that's managing your internal security alerts, performing internal threat hunting, reacting to alerts and alarms that are generated by your security systems. Those kind of day-to-day operations that your security team does are considered blue team operations. Purple team is kind of what it sounds like. It's having the red team and that blue team work together as they go through the process. This type of engagement really facilitates a good amount of knowledge transfer. So when a red team is able to identify a particular weakness, configuration issue, or maybe they've identified an attack path inside the environment, they can immediately turn around and work with the blue team to inform them of the actions taken. And the blue team, they can provide information indicators of what specific techniques were used. And then the blue team can take that information into their systems and identify if they're generating the telemetry needed to be able to make those detections and then create detections for those types of adversarial actions that were simulated by the red team. So the concept here is you're working together over time. You're generating additional value for the organization through the creation of these additional detections through the systems. And I really like to focus on, again, the technical testing because one of the things that we've always talked about with a lot of our clients is the effectiveness of controls. So we've kind of taken this concept and coined combining all these different types of technical testing in an ongoing manner into what we call advanced persistent tiger teaming. So it's kind of a play on the APT acronym used to describe advanced persistent threats in the environment, but we're kind of going, instead of with the threats, obviously the tiger teaming, which is an internal red team designed for a specific purpose. In this case, it's testing the efficacy of the security program. So going back to that continuous testing model, these threat actors, they're continually generating new tools, tactics, procedures. They're getting better at their jobs. We need to be continuously testing our internal environment as well. So we've combined it into a concept of this internal testing, the vulnerability scanning, the penetration testing, the purple teaming. We've covered it down into 4 different domains. So internal security relates to a lot of the different internal security controls, testing the efficacy of those controls, identifying vulnerabilities, performing vulnerability scans, auditing, various baselines of systems inside of an environment. It's really kind of a wide encompassing set of audits and tests and scans for an internal environment to help provide a lot of the technical details to prevent threat actors from being able to move around inside the environment. Similarly, we have an external security domain, so that's ongoing monitoring of anything that would be considered internet facing. Those types of assets are typically the most at risk because they are directly accessible by threat actors. Any type of weakness or vulnerability in those type of assets can lead to direct access to breaching that external security perimeter for an organization. So that external security is really about monitoring attack surface. It's more about identifying any kind of software vulnerabilities and weaknesses and being able to respond to them before a threat actor can identify them. Web application security. A lot of organizations do internal development of web applications, or they have web applications that they procure from commercial entities, often referred to as COTS products, that process very sensitive information. So performing, detailed web application penetration tests against these applications can help identify weaknesses and shore those up before they are identified by threat actors. And then the last category domain that we have there is threat emulation. So threat emulation is going back to that penetration testing, that adversarial threat emulation, that red teaming exercise. And what we've done there is that includes, different types of white box and gray box tests that are available. But we've also aligned a lot of what we do with emulating tools, tactics, and techniques that are documented in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So for those that aren't familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, it is a framework that has been developed by MITRE to go through and identify any types of tactics and techniques used by threat actors in real-world breaches. So they'll go back through, they'll do investigations, and they'll identify how threat actors were able to perform initial exploitation, or how they were able to achieve persistence inside of an environment. They'll document all those different techniques that are used by different threat actors, and they've put them into this framework that can be used. Going through and emulating those different techniques in an environment in a very methodical process in a purple teaming type scenario, you can identify if your organization is able to effectively detect or prevent those techniques. And in cases where prevention is not an option, ensuring that the telemetry is available to detect those items and then chain those together to identify an attack in progress is really important. So again, in a purple team type scenario, we go through and we emulate those techniques and provide that information and knowledge transfer to the blue team to be able to create those detections if necessary. These are kind of the 4 high-level domains of kind of this ongoing testing concept. One other thing that's really important as you're going through and creating kind of a internal testing plan is we've coined it as it's very similar to an audit plan for those that are familiar with that. So with audit plans, you typically have, predefined out 2 to 3 years what specific applications and systems you're going to conduct audits on based upon risk level. Very similarly, going through, we have a whole host inside of those 4 core domains that I just mentioned of predefined audits and tests. Again, in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, there's over 170 different attack techniques documented. So we actually go through and we'll create an audit and a test plan related to the continuous technical testing for a lot of our clients with it. That really kind of helps, again, as you're going over time, be able to ensure that you have a plan to be able to move your security program forward. When you have this type of capability internally to conduct these ongoing technical tests, one thing that's really important to make sure is, even once you have a plan, to be able to make sure that you can react to changes in the environment. So again, as everyone is well aware, enterprise networks are not static entities. They are constantly changing every day, with whether it's patches being pushed out, hardware changes inside the environment. It'll be really important with internal testing teams to go through and have what we coin is, again, reactive testing blocks to validate those particular changes. A really good example of one of those changes might be is if you're changing, firewalls. A lot of times if you're changing vendors, there's not going to be a one-to-one policy import that you can do that'll make sure that nothing changes in the desired outcome of those, access control lists or integrated security tools inside your firewall. So we typically will meet monthly and discuss any type of changes that an organization might have. In the case of, again, of a particular firewall that's more of a UTM type appliance being changed out, we can go through and perform validation and verification testing to make sure that those policies that were transferred over to the new firewall did not change the security outcomes or the efficacy of the control of the desired state. So that could include, egress, ingress port scanning to make sure that the ACLs are the same, egress port scanning to make sure that no new ports are allowed outbound. It could include, again, if your firewall integrates with web filtering capabilities, again, testing those different types of policies to make sure that, no particular categories or types of risky websites were opened up that weren't previously there. So again, having that type of internal ongoing testing is going to be really important to be able to react to any kind of organizational changes to the environment. So earlier I mentioned that we had discussed kind of having one of the domains that we look at is external security. For a lot of organizations, we include regular touch points for monitoring the attack surface of the organization. The attack surface, external attack surface, is what we would define as really anything that's directly accessible from the internet for the organization. That it can include their the corporate network, any types of remote access solutions they have, any types of services that are available. Providing ongoing monitoring for that is really important to identify any particular changes. Again, these assets that are externally facing are at the highest risk because they are directly accessible to threat actors. So the more frequent touch points you can have, the quicker you can identify any changes that might introduce risk to the organization. As a part of the Advanced Persistent Tiger Teaming Service, we've identified unauthorized changes made to internet environments, so changes that didn't go through the corporate change control process. In particular, new network equipment being set up that had default credentials that, if it had not been found by our attack surface monitoring and analysis first and found by a threat actor, it would have led to a breach of an external perimeter. So being able to flag those types of new services being spun up and identify what they are and vet them before a threat actor can is a really valuable type of offering. And additionally, and as I'm sure everyone's aware, there has been a whole host of very high risk remote code execution vulnerabilities in a lot of remote access types of systems over the past year. A lot of these vulnerabilities have fueled a lot of the implementation, a lot of the exploits for these ransomware threat actors. They have been able to leverage some of these remote code execution vulnerabilities on these external systems to be able to gain a foothold and then gain access to an internal network and then spread the ransomware. So I've highlighted some of the the high risk ones here. This is from a CERT advisory from not that long ago, talking about how some of these threat actors are using these particular types of vulnerabilities. But you can see these are in a lot of cases technologies that a lot of organizations have that are internet facing. A lot of them are remote access solutions, such as the Citrix items. So a lot of these vulnerabilities have been related to SSL VPN that a lot of organizations have internet facing that have allowed these threat actors to start to gain access. In some cases, some of these particular vulnerabilities even allow bypassing of authentication of multi-factor authentication systems that are in place. So there was some speculation that the recent, I think, released in June Cisco vulnerability, there was a path traversal that allowed you to read any types of files on the Cisco, would actually expose session cookies that could be replayed by a threat actor that would bypass multi-factor authentication controls. So again, as a part of our advanced persistent tiger teaming concept, monitoring for these types of vulnerabilities, we typically generate what we call a technology attack surface map as well. So a detailed listing of all technologies that are internet facing for an organization, and that even includes detailed technologies inside of websites, so frameworks that are used, JavaScript libraries, things like that, and monitoring for these types of issues that are really high risk for organizations. We've actually been able to perform verification testing for a lot of clients, and in some cases where they think that they've deployed a particular patch to all their internet-facing routers or firewalls, we've gone through and performed verification testing and found, a system where it's been missed. And again, these are extremely high-risk vulnerabilities, and without that type of monitoring and verification testing, it could be identified by a threat actor and exploited. So this type of ongoing monitoring and testing is very, very important to determine, again, the efficiency of our controls and our processes that we have in place. We include web application testing. Again, we've gone through in some of our testing for our clients and identified high-risk vulnerabilities inside of web applications that could have led to the exposure of sensitive information inside the web applications. We've also identified, so previously I just mentioned the technology attack map. We do some incident response work as well, and through some of that incident response work, we've identified, threat actors going after particular internal web application frameworks. So things that aren't necessarily directly exposed, but are used in the development of the application, that they've been able to exploit those technologies. So we've been able to identify that with our clients and then go through and ensure that they are protected before they were exploited by these particular threat actors. So kind of getting back to this concept of continuous control testing, you really have those three different concepts: the existence, which is tying back to that risk assessment, so your planning exercises; the configuration, which is auditing to the standard; and the effectiveness, which is the technical testing that we're talking about here. That's validating the outcomes, expected outcomes of those particular controls. Threat simulations are great for validating the outcomes of those controls. Threat simulations, you can conduct internal red team testing and identify if your controls are able to prevent or detect simulated threat actions inside of environments. We do this type of testing all the time and are able to identify weaknesses in control configurations that allow particular actions or allow bypassing of detection, and help make sure that our clients are able to tweak those controls to make sure that they're operating the way that they intend to be operating. But again, that testing to ensure the effectiveness of the control is very key, and threat simulations are great for that. Getting into detailed particular controls, it's really important to, again, validate the control and what your expectation is. So you can perform, risk assessments and audits of your particular controls, but actually going through and testing the outcomes of the control is really important to identify potential weaknesses. So in cases, we've been able to go through and identify weaknesses in, say, spam filtering controls by actually going through and sending malicious samples through the email system and identifying different points on how those spam controls work with email systems that have allowed bypasses of those particular controls, and make sure that those are are remediated again before they're exploited by the threat actor. In some cases, organizations pay a lot of money for specialized controls that you really have no way to test. So a good example of that is, network attached storage devices. There are some that sell additional add-on features that claim that they can block ransomware. We've had clients that have come to us and asked us to be able to try to help them validate that particular type of control. So they've paid a lot of money for this particular control, but they don't know exactly how it works and if it would actually be able to block ransomware. So we worked with those clients, designed a testing plan, and kind of created our own simulated ransomware. Going through that process, what we identified is the control did detect some of the simulated ransomware actions, but it didn't actually stop anything. And going through and looking through the control itself, we found where you can actually configure it to go through and prevent that. So again, doing that kind of control validation and outcome testing up front, had they waited till an actual ransomware event, they would have got alerts and they would have been able to manually respond, but it wouldn't have stopped the attack automatically without that testing to identify that particular weakness. So again, a really good example of why this type of testing can help save a lot of headache later down the road. One thing I did want to mention as well is continuous control monitoring. So if you're familiar with NIST, this is a concept where you continuously monitor your controls and the health of your controls inside your environment. The type of testing that I'm referring to can play a part in that, but it's a little bit different. The continuous monitoring of controls, as NIST defines, is really more closely related to kind of auditing those particular controls to a standard and monitoring the health of those particular controls as to testing the outcome of the particular controls. But again, the type of technical testing that we're talking about that does test the effectiveness of the controls can play into this continuous control monitoring concept that NIST defines. And there's a lot of benefits to this. Again, having a planned, predefined, programmatic approach to your testing can make sure that you're testing the effectiveness of all the controls inside your environment, and you can risk rate those particular controls and test higher risk controls more frequently. Again, going through and making sure that you have, you're able to be agile with your testing and react to changes in the environment is going to be really important, because the risk will change again with major changes to the environment. Having that knowledge transfer to be able to feed back into your detection programs is really important to be able to continue to mature your processes in your internal program over time. Again, just like the ransomware threat actors are continuously maturing their processes, it's really important that we keep up our internal processes and programs over time as well. One other benefit of kind of this internal ongoing testing is really just making sure that with typical assessments, you'll receive a lot of findings all at once. By the time you get to remediation efforts, you're not quite sure if the data that's provided in that assessment 8 months ago is still relevant. So this type of ongoing testing breaks it down into more manageable chunks, which is nice. Again, monitoring and testing for high-risk issues as disclosed, but that gets back to those really critical vulnerabilities. And it meets the demanding need for regulated industries. So CIS actually has a whole area of their program now, I think it's Control 20, around penetration testing programs and the need for ongoing testing. So a lot of the different frameworks and industries are kind of moving in this direction to, instead of having individual point-in-time assessments, to these ongoing engagements that allow you to continuously test and improve your program over time. With that said, that's really discusses the importance of the continuous testing. Guy, throw it back over to you.
Thank you, Mike. So we're going to change presentation here. I'm just going to pause very quick before we change to Corey's presentation and see if anybody has questions. So I don't know Natalie, if you want to unmute, or if you want to collect the questions through the chat, whatever works for you.
Yeah, and I haven't seen any submitted yet through the chat. I've been watching it for you. But if anyone does want to unmute and ask a question before we move on, you're more than welcome to do that right now. Guy, I think it's a pretty quiet group right now.
All right. Well, if you have any question at any point, just think about your question. You can send them to the chat, or hopefully we'll have a few minutes after Corey's presentation to talk through that. So Corey, are you able to share your screen here?
Yes. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
And I'm having trouble starting my webcam. It says that it failed to start it, but I'll share my screen real quick.
Okay,
Are
we
you
can
able to
see you.
see?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Now, I apologize. I'm having issues with the webcam feature. All right, we'll get started. So my name is Corey Schell, and I am a senior cybersecurity consultant with Dean Dorton. When I first started my career in information technology in 2009, I started at First United Bank and Trust in Madisonville, Kentucky, working as a network administrator. And in that role, I worked through multiple exams and audits. I then transitioned to technology consulting with Dean Dorton in 2013, and now I work with clients to improve their security programs by helping to co-source the development, implementation, and maintenance of their security program, as well as by performing security assessments and penetration tests to find weaknesses and help them improve their cybersecurity. So you know what they say, an audit is like a box of chocolates. You never really know what you're going to get. Sometimes you may find yourself with an overzealous auditor and everyone and everything gets a finding. Sometimes you'll find that no matter how much you prepare or if you resolve all of the previous audit findings, they will probably find something else the next time. And then occasionally you may get a very intimidating auditor. My wife, who is an auditor, falls into this category sometimes, in my opinion. But jokes aside, the purpose of this presentation, we're going to be discussing some real-life scenarios on audit and exam findings that clients of ours in the financial sector have received over the past year, and some projects that we have worked with them to help improve and satisfy these exam and audit findings. So the first one, the first comment, we had a client that had an exam and they stated that you're using the FFIEC CAT, but you are not using a control framework. And so some of you may recall or be familiar with the FFIEC Cybersecurity Assessment Tool, which was released in 2015 and then updated again in 2017. And the purpose of that tool is to help financial institutions identify risks and assess their cybersecurity preparedness. And it's intended for financial institutions of all sizes to do this self-assessment and inform their risk management strategies. So to complete the assessment, it consists of an inherent risk profile, as well as cybersecurity maturity levels that cover 5 domains. So the inherent risk profile is about 39 questions over 5 categories, includes technologies and connection types, delivery channels, online mobile products and technology services, and then organizational characteristics. And when you answer those questions, they range from risk level of least all the way up to most. And it really, your answers are going to vary depending on the complexity of your institution. So after you answer those inherent risk profile questions, you then move to the domains. And within each domain are assessment factors, contributing components, and within each component is a declarative statement. There's about 495 declarative statements in total. After you review the inherent risk profile and the maturity levels across the domains, you can make a determination whether your maturity levels are appropriate in relation to your risk. If not, the institution can take action to reduce the level of risk or to increase levels of maturity. And it's important to note that this process is intended to complement and not replace your risk management process and a cybersecurity program. So in the previous presentation, Mike talked about the types of tests and evaluations according to the FFIEC. So according to the FFIEC, the primary types of tests include self-assessments, penetration tests, vulnerability assessments, and audits. So the CAT is considered a self-assessment. It's important to note that the CAT is not a control framework, so it's not a replacement for control framework. However, there is a cross-mapping with some control frameworks, which we're going to discuss more now. So to address this particular exam finding for our clients, we discussed various control frameworks that we could implement to help meet that requirement. So when you look at the control frameworks, these are really the most popular ones, and we're going to cover them a bit more in depth on the following slides. Some of these focus on system controls, and some are far more comprehensive and focus on broader implementation of controls, programs, and policies. And I'll point out COBIT, we're not going to go into detail on that one. It's really a different beast altogether. It's meant to be an umbrella framework for enterprise IT governance. So we're going to discuss the NIST cybersecurity framework first. It's really a very objective-based, very flexible type of control framework. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on another slide on what I mean by that. But it's very easy for you to map more prescriptive frameworks to help you get more context for this framework. So the framework itself is divided into 5 functions. Those are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And within each of those functions are categories. So if we look at the recover function, the categories include recovery, planning, improvements, and communications. Within each of those categories is subcategories, and there's about up to 108 of those controls or subcategories depending on your implementation tier. And the implementation tiers range from tier 1, which is partial, tier 2, risk informed, tier 3, repeatable, and tier 4, which is adaptive. Now, some concerns with the framework. Privacy is not addressed in the core framework, but it is covered in the draft NIST privacy framework. So it's a separate publication which you can use to meet privacy requirements that aren't covered here. And the biggest concern with the adoption of this control framework is that it kind of lacks details on the controls, and we'll explain that on another slide. So another control framework we recommend you look at is the CIS critical security controls, and those controls are separated into basic, foundational, and organizational controls. And there's 20 control areas, and there's 171 sub-controls across 3 various implementation tiers. So concerns here, it does not address governance and risk management. There's a separate risk management model from CIS that does address risk management. It also does not cover privacy. But this is a very prescriptive control framework. And then another one that's very popular is ISO 27000. When this is an internationally recognized control framework, and it provides requirements for documentation, implementation, internal audits, and continuous improvement and action plans. It scales 14 domains and about 114 controls in total. It is also not free. It does cost money. So let's clarify what we mean when we say objective versus prescriptive. Let's go into a little bit more detail. So if we look at just a single subcategory in the NIST cybersecurity framework, let's look at the IDAM-2 subcategory. So software platforms and applications within the organization are inventoried. So this defines an outcome, but it doesn't necessarily describe how exactly this needs to be achieved. So you have a lot of flexibility in determining how that is achieved in your institution. So what you can do, and you'll see the informative references there, what we recommend you do is maybe consider an objective-based control framework like the NIST CSF. Help this, use this to build your security program and help guide it. And then you can map this, cross-map it to something more prescriptive, like the CIS critical security controls. So if we look at the CIS top 20, and we're looking at the inventory control of software assets domain there, it is far more prescriptive. I mean, it will tell you, if you're looking for clarity, it does a really good job bringing detailed requirements for how those control objectives, like software asset management, should be met, down to the usage of the technical tools, what information about the software the technical tools should track, and what should be done about unauthorized software. So when we look at ISO 27000, it's worth noting that this provides more details than this CSS, but it's less context than the CIS top 20. So some control guidance is it's provided, but oftentimes the statements are made to be vague and left open to your interpretation. And it does give you a little bit of flexibility. Okay, so the next scenario we've worked with is a client being told they're not meeting best practices for strong passwords. So let's talk about password management. So got some memes to share with you here. I changed all of my passwords to incorrect, so whenever I forget, it will tell me your password is incorrect. Using the same password everywhere, I too like to live dangerously. Someone figured out my password. Now I have to rename my dog. Equifax creates account as admin to manage credit disputes of millions and sets account's password as admin. Data gets breached. Equifax, surprise Pikachu face. And then of course, I had to include a very cute baby Yoda here. People makes password. Hackers guess the password. And then shocked baby Yoda face. So I'm going to go over, this is a very common password policy that we see everywhere, not just in maybe financial institutions, but other institutions as well, like in healthcare, education. And if you look at the settings here, the maximum password age is 90 days. So users have to change the password every few months. They got a minimum requirement at 8 characters, and then obviously you require complexity requirements, so they have to have 3 of the 4 upper lower number special character. With this type of policy, it is very common for people to select passwords like you see on the screen, like password 1, company name 1, fall, summer, spring, winter, month and year, let me in. We see those passwords everywhere. So obviously, current password policies really aren't sufficient to prevent users from picking those weak common formulas that can be exploited by threat actors. So if we look at the latest password guidance from NIST to Microsoft, the first thing you start with is you need multi-factor authentication for all remote access. So anything that's internet facing, if it's your VPN, if it's Office 365, if it's any type of application that you can manage remotely or administratively, everything facing the internet should have multi-factor authentication. The next thing you should consider is actually adopting a password filter that blocks these common and weak passwords. So if you put a password filter in place with Active Directory, if a user goes to change their password to something like password 1, fall, summer, spring, winter, year, it will block it, and they'll be required to pick a password that's not in that filter's blacklist. So you also want to have a separate password policy for your standard users and admin users. Admin users and service accounts should have stronger password requirements. And preferably for your service accounts, those are random and unique passwords. And hopefully you can automate those. If you use the native service account features that are in Active Directory or in Windows Server, you can automate the rotation of those passwords to random unique passwords. Also, you want to consider using password managers or a password vault to secure passwords for these service accounts and highly privileged accounts, and require two-factor authentication to obtain access to that password manager or vault. So, and it's worth noting that, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail in the next slide, but some examiners and auditors are still recommending this legacy guidance, like the complexity requirements and frequent password changes, like changing your password every 90 days. So this guidance is taken directly from Microsoft's publication on password guidance. And they recommend maintaining, they say an 8-character minimum length requirement. We recommend a 9-character minimum at Dean Dorton. Don't require character composition requirements. So Microsoft is telling you there, do not require complexity. And that sounds very counterintuitive, from what we've been told for years. But the truth is, when you require those very strict complexity requirements, users are more likely to pick a formula that they can change every 90 days, and they just slightly alter that password every 90 days using that same formula. And the way you kind of make this a bit easier for your users, I look at it as kind of like a carrot and a stick approach. So you're giving your user a carrot when you say, okay, you do not have to have complexity requirements. So your password or your passphrase can be all lowercase. You also don't have to frequently change your password. We're just going to have you change it once per year. So you're giving them a carrot. But whenever they go to change their password, you're hitting them with a stick because you've got a password filter that blocks them and prevents them from selecting those weak passwords. So in this way, you can educate your users not to reuse organization passwords for non-work related purposes, educating them to adopt a passphrase, so which is a longer phrase that's maybe even all lowercase, but they don't have to change their password frequently, and it doesn't require complexity as long as that password or passphrase is not in the blacklist in the password filter. The other recommendations here from Microsoft are you have to enforce registration for MFA for all external remote access, and you need, if your identity protection solution supports it, you can enable risk-based multi-factor authentication. So that is, if a risk event is generated based on a user's sign-in attempt, it can then do a certain action like block access if it's from outside the United States, or require MFA if it's outside the corporate network. So the next thing is, we had a client that they were told they're not adequately managing cybersecurity risk on the cloud, and also SMS or text messages is not an acceptable second factor. So let's talk about cloud security. Got an infographic here from Microsoft that goes over some data breach statistics. They observe about 300 million daily fraudulent sign-in attempts, over 167 million daily malware attacks. And they make note of, from the Verizon DBIR report, most data breaches involve weak, default, or stolen passwords. So about 81% of those data breaches involve default, weak, and stolen passwords. So the password management that we were just discussing is really, really critical and key here. And according to Microsoft's research, they suggest that just having multi-factor authentication alone can stop about 99% of attacks. Only those 1% of very targeted attacks would be successful in those cases. And then at Microsoft's Ignite conference, they published some information. That year, they observed a 300% increase in identity attacks, about 23 million high-risk enterprise sign-in attempts that suggested that a phishing attack had been successful in a single month, 350,000 compromised accounts in a single month from a password spray attack. What a password spray attack is whenever a threat actor takes a common password, like password 1 exclamation, fall, winter, summer, spring, 2020 exclamation, and then they try that common password for thousands or even hundreds of thousands of accounts. They're just spraying that one common password using legacy authentication protocols. And they're bound, using these common password formulas unless you are stopping your users from picking those weak passwords. They are bound to be successful there with at least 1 or 2%. And after they gain access to one account, they'll use that account to target other accounts in your organization and other users or other organizations you have business relationships with. The breach replay there, what that means is they observed 4.6 billion attacker-driven sign-in attempts in a single month, and that was replaying passwords that have been published in data breaches, basically. The Microsoft, with the threat intelligence they do have the telemetry there to audit if a password is contained in a known data breach when the account's compromised. So cloud security, Microsoft has a tool or a feature they refer to as Microsoft Secure Score, and it basically gives you a score or a metric based on your implementation of controls that are available to you. Now, it's very heavily Microsoft-centric. So if you use third-party controls, like if you use Duo or Okta, some other type of solution for MFA rather than Microsoft's Azure for MFA or Microsoft Authenticator, then they don't have the ability to audit that or score it. So it's worth noting with the Secure Score, if you're using third-party controls, you may need to manually track that and manually update your score. But it is a good metric to look at. There's also another secure score that Microsoft refers to as the Azure Identity Secure Score. So it tells you how your score compares to tenants globally, as well as in your industry. So you can see where your score lines up with other financial institutions. Now, there's also a Center for Internet Security benchmark for Microsoft 365, and it covers several categories, including account and authentication. This is heavily focused on Azure Active Directory and multi-factor authentication. So I mentioned before, we had a client that basically the examiner was not satisfied, even though the client had rolled out MFA for everybody in the organization. A lot of them had SMS text messages for their second factor. And it's worth noting that NIST it basically accepts SMS as an approved second factor, but it's set to be deprecated. Because there are weaknesses with text messages, a threat actor can do what's called a SIM swap, where they basically social engineer your cell phone provider, convince them that they're you, and they swap your service to their handset with their SIM. And then if they got your password, they can complete that authentication process by sending that 6-digit PIN to their phone, basically. So it's worth noting that you probably want to be moving away from SMS-based multi-factor authentication and move toward software authenticator using an app like Okta, Duo, the free Microsoft Authenticator app. You can do a push where it'll pop up and say approve or deny the logon attempt, or even a hardware-based token. So that would be something like a YubiKey. It'd be an actual physical device that you would maybe connect to your laptop to provide that second factor. The next thing in the account authentication domain is you want to be sure that you disable legacy authentication protocols. So we've seen organizations get mailboxes compromised and account takeovers in Office 365 all the time. And the way it's typically done is with those password spray attacks that I discussed earlier, and they leverage legacy authentication protocols like IMAP and POP and SMTP. And it's worth noting that even if you've enabled multi-factor authentication, those protocols can still be abused, even if you have MFA for that account. So MFA is a part here, but you also need to be sure to disable those legacy authentication protocols. You can do that in Azure by implementing conditional access. That is something that's also scored in that account and authentication domain in the CIS control benchmark. Microsoft's got a product called Azure AD Identity Protection. If you have Azure Premium licenses, you can enable conditional access and even risk-based conditional access, where you can do geo-blocking from outside the United States, and you can, if a user has an impossible travel activity, you can block that access with the conditional access. The next category is application permissions. The big one here is, by default in Azure, users are allowed to consent to apps accessing company data on their behalf. You really need to be sure this is disabled and that you have a consent workflow for admins to approve app registrations, because threat actors have abused those application registration or the consenting to malicious apps in the past to maintain persistence to an account in the organization, even whenever you've changed that user's password. So definitely do consider disabling the consent to apps accessing company data, which is the default setting in Azure. The next thing is data management. So that usually covers data loss prevention and data classification policies if you're using Azure Information Protection. Email security, Exchange Online, this focuses on reducing risk in email and in Exchange. That includes advanced threat protection policies like safe attachments and safe links. So those are advanced controls that do like malware sandboxing of attachments before they're allowed to be delivered to a user, or rewriting links in an email to Microsoft or whatever vendor you're using, where those URLs get analyzed and a reputation assigned before the user's allowed to click through to those links. Some other controls covered in that domain include disabling mailbox forwarding, which is something we also recommend that you do. Auditing. So it used to be the case that auditing in Office 365 was an opt-in approach. So by default, previously, the unified audit log was not enabled. You actually had to proactively log in to the unified audit logging page and click enable auditing. If you didn't, then nothing was audited. And then also mailbox auditing was a opt-in feature. It was something that was not enabled by default. And so there were a bunch of incidents where Microsoft Office 365 accounts were compromised, and then the organization would try to go back and audit and look at the logs and make a determination of what might have been exposed, and the logs weren't there because auditing wasn't enabled. So it's important to make sure that auditing is enabled. The unified audit log and mailbox auditing should be enabled by default now, but it's also a good idea to check it and confirm it. You also want to have formal procedures for auditing Office 365. Storage, so that mostly covers protecting data in SharePoint as well as OneDrive. And then mobile device management, so that obviously is going to cover if you have an MDM solution, or if you have Microsoft Intune, if you're using mobile application management for bring your own device type of organization. So with mobile application management, rather than managing the devices, you're only managing the applications, like the Microsoft applications like Outlook, which have access to company data. So it's a bit more manageable in that respect if your workforce is mostly bring your own device. We've helped some clients implement mobile application management to help them manage their BYOD workforce as well. So the next finding we'll go through, you're not abiding by the principle of least privilege. So we're going to talk about privileged access management. So in the previous presentation, Guy devoted a lot of that talk to talking about ransomware. So if we're going to talk about preparing for and combating and preventing a ransomware outbreak in your organization, then we have to have a discussion about privileged access management. So there are several commercial privileged access management solutions out there that include CyberArk, BeyondTrust, and Thycotic. And one of the standard features in those solutions is they provide just-in-time access. So essentially what that is, most organizations, they have administrative users who are permanently assigned those administrative rights. So they're domain admin all the time. These type of solutions basically set up a request and approval process for those privileged users to go through, and they're only delegated that privilege that they're requesting for a specific fixed amount of time. So that might be I'm going to request domain admin rights to manage the domain controller for an hour at this time. And so that user would only be a domain admin for an hour. Now, it's worth noting that Microsoft has their own solution there they call Microsoft Identity Manager, and that is basically to provide that just-in-time access and set up what's called a bastion forest on your internal Active Directory. Now, they have a product called Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, which is an Azure AD Premium P2 licensed feature, which is essentially the same thing in the cloud. You have just-in-time access for your privileged users. They go through a request and approval process, and they are only delegated the privileges that they request for a fixed amount of time, and they are not typically permanently assigned administrative roles. Now, kind of a PAM-light model, which we've helped clients implement, is Microsoft's tier privilege model. This doesn't cost you anything. You can do this just with Active Directory and group policy. And the concept is that you have 3 different tiers for your assets. So tier 0 it'll be your domain controllers and hypervisors, because if your domain controllers get compromised, it's typically game over. And that's usually what happens whenever organizations are hit with ransomware. It starts with threat actors finding a way to compromise domain admin credentials and then getting a foothold on the domain controller. And from there, they can deploy their ransomware to pretty much everything that's joined to the domain. And then, so tier 0 is your domain controllers and hypervisors, like if you have ESXi. Tier 1 would be member servers, and tier 2 would be workstations and laptops. So with this tiered privilege model, commonly we'll see most organizations, their admins have a standard user account, and then they have a domain admin account. With this tiered privilege model, those admins might have a standard user account, a domain admin account, a server admin account, and then a workstation admin account. So you may have 3 or even several administrative accounts that are separate, and they have unique passwords. And it's very important that you implement restrictions to prevent those highly privileged accounts like domain admins being used to log on interactively on lower tier assets like member servers and workstations. Why do you want to do that? Well, modern malware and tools that threat actors use, like Mimikatz, give threat actors and malware the ability to compromise the credentials of a logged in user on a Windows system to steal those credentials or that token from memory. So if you have a user that their computer gets infected with malware and it gets something like TrickBot on it, and a domain admin logs into that workstation, it can steal that domain admin's credentials and then propagate to every system in the domain. In fact, most of the ransomware incidents that we've been pulled into has usually involved malware like TrickBot, and it is typically an entire domain-wide compromise. And the most effective way to mitigate this is with the PAM solution or this tiered privilege model. The other thing that you want to do, something we've seen several times, is sometimes everybody's a local administrator. Sometimes it's done through group policy where all domain users are local admins, and that's very risky because you really want to restrict local admin rights for your end users as much as possible. And if some of your end users do have to have local admin rights for certain business requirements, then you want to make sure that they log in as a standard user, and then they maybe have a local admin account that they only ever use when they need to elevate privileges for whatever those business requirements are. The next thing is you want to make sure that local administrator accounts are managed. Microsoft has a free tool called Local Administrator Password Solution, or LAPS, and that tool allows you to set random and unique passwords for all local admin accounts. And again, why is this important? If a threat actor or malware compromises a single system and it's able to dump the hashes for the local accounts on that system, it can do what's called a pass the hash attack and replay that hash on other systems that share that same password. So you want to be sure that those passwords are random and unique for local accounts. The next thing is having host or network firewall rules. So Threat actors always will use administrative protocols like RDP, WMI, or server message block to propagate and to deploy ransomware in the environment. And if you are blocking those ports and protocols for administrative functions, and you restrict it by, say, like the IT management VLAN, where only the IT management VLAN can access those ports and protocols on systems, or like if you've got a server that deploys software on the environment, having network and host-based ACLs that limit that traffic, then malware, if it gains a foothold on a workstation, can't propagate. It can't move to any other systems that if it can't hit those ports and protocols that are used administratively, like WMI, SMB, and RDP. And then lastly, this kind of goes in line with the Microsoft tiered privilege model, but it's called a privileged access workstation, or a PA. So a PA is basically like your IT admins have their own administrative workstation, and they separate their daily user functions from their administrative functions. So that could be they have a virtual machine, which they do higher risk activities like surfing the web and checking email from that virtual machine. It may not even be a domain joined machine. And then their host machine, basically they're like their host hypervisor, they use that to do all the administrative stuff, the day-to-day administrative functions of managing the domain controllers, servers, network equipment, et cetera. So I've got a screenshot here, and this is just to give you kind of a visual representation of what that model looks like. So the tiered privilege model there, your admins having separate admin accounts for those various tiers, so like a domain admin, server admin, workstation admin account, and then having restrictions in place so that those accounts cannot be used basically downstream. You can't use a domain admin account on a member server. You can't use a member server account on a workstation. If those accounts are never being used to log in interactively on those systems, then those credentials cannot be stolen by a malware or a threat actor that has a foothold on those systems. And then likewise, if you look on the right there, that's the privileged access workstation model, and you'll see if you're using a user virtual machine for those higher risk activities like checking email and surfing the web, and then your physical machine you use for administrative functions, there's very little risk there. But if you're using your users, or if you're using the actual workstation itself to do administrative activities, then that is a privilege escalation risk. Okay, the next finding is you're not abiding by the principle of least functionality. And so to talk about that, we really need to talk about system hardening and configuration management. So when we discuss system hardening, there's several hardening benchmarks that are out there. So Microsoft has one. It used to be called Security Compliance Manager. Now it's called Security Compliance Toolkit. And it's basically a set of predefined and pre-built group policy objects you can import into your group policy and help you to build your own secure baseline. There's also DISA-STIG, which is well known and adopted in federal and state organizations. There's the Center for Internet Security benchmarks as well, and those actually are not free. So the benchmarks themselves are free to download, but if you want to get the actual GPOs that you can easily import in your organization, as well as a SCAP tool you can use to scan for compliance to those benchmarks. That is a commercial solution that's called the CIS Secure Suite, so that there's a cost there. There's also hardening systems. Manufacturers usually have documentation you can leverage to harden those systems and reduce functionality. And then Microsoft Intune actually has secure baselines built in by default. So if you're using Microsoft Intune, you can build those baselines in the cloud for your workstations and laptops. But we use the Microsoft Security Compliance Toolkit, and we've helped clients implement the Security Compliance Toolkit baselines. And then you can use a tool like Tenable Nessus, like a vulnerability scanning tool, to audit for compliance for those baselines. So when we talk about configuration management, we have to discuss least functionality. We're talking about configuring the system to provide only essential capabilities and these can include prohibiting or restricting the use of functions, ports, protocols, and services. So as with many security activities, planning can greatly impact the success or failure of the effort. The first step is planning, which includes developing a policy and procedures to incorporate configuration management into the IT and security program, and then disseminate that policy throughout the organization. So that first phase, the policy addresses areas such as the implementation of configuration management plans, the integration into existing security program plans, the configuration control board or a change approval board if you have a CAB, configuration change control processes, tools, and technology. So the use of common secure configurations with baseline configurations, monitoring and metrics for compliance with established configuration management policy and procedures. So the next phase is identifying and implementing configuration. So after you've finished planning and the preparation activities, a secure baseline for the system should be developed, reviewed, approved, and implemented. So the approved baseline configuration for a system and its components should be consistent with whatever your operational or business requirements and constraints are. So for a typical system, the baseline might address configuration settings, like in the registry, installed software, patch levels, how the information system is physically or logically arranged, how various controls are implemented, and being sure to document all of that. So where possible, automation is used to enable the interoperability of tools and uniformity of baseline configuration across the system. So that could include the system images and using features like group policy or Intune to automate the implementation of some of those settings. So controlling configuration changes, given the continually evolving nature of a system and the mission it supports, the challenge for organizations is not only to establish that initial baseline configuration that represents a secure state, but is also cost-effective, functional, and supports the mission and the business requirements. But you also need to maintain a secure configuration in the face of significant waves of change that typically ripple throughout the organization. So in this phase, the emphasis is to put on management to maintain a secure and approved baseline of the system through sound configuration management practices, ensure the changes are formally identified, proposed, reviewed, and analyzed for security or business impact, and then test and approve prior to the implementation. As part of the configuration change control effort, you should employ a variety of access restrictions for change, including access controls, automation of processes, change windows, and verification and audit activities to limit unauthorized or undocumented changes. And then finally, monitoring. So the monitoring activities are used as the mechanism within configuration management to validate that the system is adhering to organizational policies, procedures, and the approved secure baseline configuration. Planning and implementing those secure configurations and then controlling the configuration change is usually not sufficient to ensure that a system which was once secure will remain secure. Monitoring identifies undiscovered, undocumented system components, misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, and unauthorized changes, which, if they're not addressed, can expose the organization to increased risk. So the use of automated tools usually facilitates situational awareness and the documentation of deviations from the baseline configuration. And then the monitoring is done through assessment and reporting activities, which includes reports that addressing the secure state of individual system configurations and using that as input to your risk management program. So the next finding we've worked assisted a client with is they were told they were not adequately tracking and managing vulnerabilities. So we're going to discuss vulnerability management. So vulnerability management is really the cyclical, never-ending practice of identifying, classifying, prioritizing, remediating, and mitigating software vulnerabilities. So it is not a destination, it's a journey that never ends. Vulnerability management is a key component in planning for and determining the appropriate implementation of controls and the management of risk. And the first phase of that developing a vulnerability management capability is to define a strategy for achieving whatever your organization's goals are. And that strategy should align with your vulnerability management processes to your requirements and critical success factors. So defining that strategy includes gathering input and support from all of the stakeholders. And that includes determining the scope of vulnerability management and determining the approved methods of vulnerability assessment. So what are the approved tools? What are the approved processes? What is in scope for the vulnerability management program? Now that strategy needs to be converted into a plan with rules and guidelines for the vulnerability management teams, and they need to understand what is expected of them and how they will use the resources they have. So the planning phase consists of defining and documenting the plan, defining what the measures of effectiveness are, defining training requirements, determining the tools aligned to the strategy, identifying the source of vulnerability information, defining the roles and responsibilities, and then developing a plan revision process. So then moving on to the capability phase, the organization actually should implement the vulnerability management plan and conduct vulnerability analysis and resolution activities. It makes use of the methodologies, tools, and sources defined in the previous phases and mitigates your exposure to the vulnerability based on the timeframes that are agreed to in the plan. So throughout the performance of the vulnerability analysis and resolution, you should take steps to ensure that the vulnerability is tracked, and improvement information is collected, and the risk management process is engaged where appropriate. So the foundational steps in that phase is to provide training, conduct vulnerability assessment activities, record discovered vulnerabilities, and then categorize and prioritize vulnerabilities, manage exposure to discovered vulnerabilities, determine the effectiveness of vulnerability dispositions, and then analyze root causes for vulnerabilities. So root causes may typically be certain manual configuration changes that have to be resolved or remediate a vulnerability. It could be that a tool is not configured effectively, or it's not covered by the tools that are used by your organization. So in the final phase, we get to assess and improve the capability. So in this phase, analysis is the ability to determine the extent of the vulnerability and its anticipated effect on your organization and its critical services. Assessing the overall vulnerability management capability ensures that both analysis and discovery of those vulnerabilities are meeting your needs. And the core foundational steps in the assessment and improvement of the vulnerability management capability is to determine the state of the program. So what is the current state? Collect and analyze program information, and then improve the capability and move toward a desired state for the vulnerability management program. So to do that, we highly recommend that you do your own vulnerability scanning internally in your organization. And it's very important that those scans are authenticated scans so you get the full context about vulnerabilities on the system. And that can only be done if local checks are performed. And without authentication, those local checks cannot enumerate vulnerabilities that cannot be verified with remote checks. So you're not getting the full picture without the authenticated scans on vulnerabilities like privilege escalation vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities with software locally on the system, as an example. You also want to have a formal exception process for tracking and reporting on vulnerabilities, like if you got an IT steering or committee or a similar IT security steering committee, but you want to have that exception process to track and report on those vulnerabilities which are unable to be remediated due to whatever your business requirements are. Sometimes you can't remediate vulnerabilities because you have business requirements that you have to basically accept the risk of a vulnerability for. So be sure you're tracking that, and there's a formal process for it. Also, you want to establish some remediation service level agreements. So examples of SLAs for your vulnerability management program might be 24 hours to mitigate a zero-day vulnerability. So let's say you have a Cisco firewall, and then Cisco publishes a disclosure that there's a zero-day vulnerability, and that they're going to push a patch out shortly, which will be available within a few days or a week. But until that time, they give you a mitigation, so something you can disable on the firewall as an example. you disable a certain functionality, and that mitigates the risk. So your SLA might say that, okay, if we can mitigate a risk and it's in line with our business requirements, then we have 24 hours to mitigate it, or if it's a 0-day, and then 72 hours to actually remediate or install a patch. And then you might have like a 30-day SLA for critical, 60 days for high, and so on. It's really up to your institution to define whatever your SLAs are and to track those. So we also recommend establishing key risk indicators for the program. So for vulnerability management, that might include a KRI, which is tracks the number of vulnerabilities for which public exploit code is available, number of vulnerabilities which are known to be exploited by malware, the time to remediate, so actually tracking your vulnerabilities that are outside your defined SLAs that are not exceptions that are outstanding. Those are some typical KRIs you might use for your program. The next one, and this is the last one, is your incident response procedures are not sufficient. So we're going to talk about incident response. And so there's a couple of different incident response models that I would encourage you to look at. NIST has one. It's called NIST Publication 800-61, and then SANS also has a model which really lines right up with it. The NIST model really consolidates some of the steps here in the SANS model. So the first step, you need a policy, and a policy provides a written set of principles, rules, or practices within your organization. It's really a keystone element that provides guidance as to whether an incident has occurred and what's to be done. So you also need a response plan and a strategy. So after establishing the policies, it's time to create a plan and a strategy to handle those incidents. The prioritization of incidents should typically be based upon the impact of them. For example, a single workstation not being functional can be considered minor, whereas a server being down could be considered a moderate impact, and data being stolen would be considered to be a high impact. You also need playbooks. So in order to minimize negative impacts and restore data, systems, and operations, you need a collection of incident response playbooks that lay out highly detailed and pre-planned procedures to be followed when a particular type of incident occurs. So because your institution is unique, these playbooks need to be tailored to your operations and your business requirements. And they should be regularly updated as your organization, infrastructure, systems, and data evolve. So each type of threat your business faces should be addressed within its own playbook, and your collection should include playbooks that address threat specifics or specific to your business. So the usual culprits could be malware, phishing, ransomware, unauthorized access, data breaches, extortion, DDoS attack, insider abuse of privileges, credentials, application, or systems. So having a set of pre-planned, formally defined procedures for each of those types of scenarios. So the next thing is communication. You need a communication plan. Due to the fact that it may be necessary to contact specific individuals or external sources like the FBI during an incident. And the entire incident response team should know whom to contact, what the contact information is, when it's appropriate to contact them and why. And if you don't have a communications plan, then it's likely that the response time might be delayed, or the wrong people might be contacted, and maybe someone who may not have the proper resources necessary to mitigate the problem. It's also important that you include out-of-band communication in that plan. If some of your systems may be down in a certain incident, so like email may not be available, Teams may not be available. So having different out-of-band communication documented is very important. So in documentation, it's extremely beneficial to stress that this element is particularly necessary and can be a substantial lifesaver when it comes to incident response. So the most significant reason to document an incident is if that incident is considered a criminal act, then it could be used as evidence to bring the suspect to justice potentially. The other reason for documentation is it's just as important for lessons learned, which is the final phase here. It's vital that everything that is done by the team is documented. That means every action taken, commands typed, systems affected, etc. And the documentation should be able to answer the who, what, where, when, why, and how questions should those ever arise. So training, this is a must, because without it, your team could be ill-prepared, and it could result in a complete failure of handling an incident properly despite the best of planning. So it's recommended to have drills at regular intervals to ensure that each individual knows how to perform their duties during an incident. You can also build a jump bag. So a jump bag is basically a kit where all of the tools you would need during an incident could be contained in the jump bag that could be quickly grabbed by incident response team members. So that can include tools like software and hardware that's ready to be utilized during an incident. That can range from anti-malware tools to laptops with packet sniffers, screwdrivers, as well as just checklists as well for those team members. So not having those tools readily available, it's like trying to kayak without a paddle. Okay, so moving to the phases of incident response. So the preparation phase of the incident response team includes planning, communication, and practice of the incident response process. This phase, as its name implies, deals with preparing a team to be ready to handle an incident at a moment's notice. And there are several key elements to have implemented in that phase in order to help mitigate any potential problems that may hinder one's ability to handle the incident. Regardless of whatever the cause of the incident is, the preparation is the most crucial phase compared to all of the others, as it will determine how well your team will be able to respond in the event of a crisis. So the identification phase deals with the detection and determination of whether a deviation from normal operations within the organization is an incident. So its scope is really helping you ensure that a security event is an actual incident. So at this stage, members should be notified and communication should be coordinated between members along with the designated staff. Responders should be documenting everything that they are doing. As stated earlier, these include documenting who, what, where, why, and how, in case that documentation needs to be used in court. So a good example of the identification phase is a user contacting the help desk and reporting that their system is acting strangely, or maybe an IDS system reporting unusual network traffic. It could come down to something ominous as usual activity in system logs that's never appeared before. It's extremely beneficial to keep a truly open mind to the number of possibilities and actually confirming that an incident has taken place. So the next phase is containment. So the primary purpose of containment is to limit the damage and prevent any further damage from happening. There's several steps to that phase. However, each one is necessary in order to completely mitigate the incident and prevent the destruction of any evidence that may be needed later for prosecution. The first step is short-term containment. So that's basically, in the very short term, you're trying to limit the damage as much as possible. That could include isolating the network segment that's infected, or taking down production servers and having all traffic routed to failover servers. It's not intended to be a long-term solution to the problem. It's only to stop the bleeding, basically. The second step is a system backup. It's necessary before wiping and re-imaging any systems to take a forensic image of that system with tools that are reputable and well-known in the computer forensics community. That can include tools like FTK, the Forensic Toolkit, or Encase. And the reason behind that is the forensic software is going to capture the affected system at the current state when the incident occurred, and therefore preserve evidence if in fact a criminal activity was done. So the last phase in that containment phase is the long-term containment, and that's essentially where the affected systems are brought back to production. And the primary focus is removing accounts or backdoors left by attackers on those affected systems, installing patches if vulnerabilities were exploited by the threat actors to gain a foothold. There's basically that phase will get you back up to your business operations. So a good example of containment is disconnecting affected systems by either disconnecting the network cable, powering down switches or routers to entire portions of the network to isolate them, and that will isolate the problem from the rest of the production network and limit the spread of any malware or reduce the risk of further systems being compromised. So the eradication phase deals with the actual removal and restoration of affected systems. As with each of the prior phases, you need to be sure to continue the documentation. It's also necessary to ensure that proper steps were taken to remove malicious or other illicit content off of the affected systems. So ensuring that persistence mechanisms, if they were used, like if the registry was modified or scheduled tasks were set up, that those were removed. And a good example of actions performed during the eradication phase might be using the original disk images that were created prior to a system being deployed into production. So, actually restoring by system image. And then moving to the recovery phase, that phase is intended to bring the affected systems back into production environment and to ensure that it will not lead to another incident. So it's essential to test, monitor, and validate that the systems being put back into production are not infected. And some important decisions to make during that phase are the time and date to restore operations, how to test and verify that the compromised systems are clean and fully functional, the duration of monitoring to observe for abnormal behaviors, the tools to test, monitor, and validate system behavior. And then moving from the recovery phase to the most critical phase, really, is the lessons learned phase. The purpose of that phase is to complete any documentation that was not done during the incident, as well as any additional documentation that may be beneficial in future incidents. So the documentation should be written in the form of a report to provide play-by-play answer of who, what, where, why, and how questions. And the overall goal there is to learn from the incident that occurred and to improve the team's performance and provide reference materials in the event of a similar incident in the future. So the lessons learned should typically be performed as soon as possible within two weeks typically after the incident occurred. The meeting should go through the incident response effort with a finalization in an executive summary format. It should be kept short as to not lose the audience's attention and remain professional. So it should include, when was the problem first detected and by whom, the scope of the incident, how it was contained and eradicated, the work performed during recovery, areas where the team were effective, and then the areas where the team can improve. And it should also include time for suggestions and discussion between team members of how to improve the overall team. And it's extremely beneficial to have members share ideas and information in order to improve the team effectiveness in future incidents. And that's all I have. And at this point, I'll take questions if you have any.
Yeah, Corey, I haven't seen any in the chat. If anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, please feel free to do so.
And then if there's no questions, I think we're going to send the presentation out right now. And then you have our email addresses. So if you do have questions anytime after, please feel free to reach out to one of us. We'll be more than happy to address your questions.
Yes, thank you. And if you all want to send them to me, I can also get them to the team at Dean Dorton too. So just keep that in mind, that we are here to help and here to answer any questions. All right, thank you all so much. We really appreciate you all taking the time to do this for us today. And thank you everybody for attending as well. And if there's no other questions, then we'll adjourn today and we'll see people tomorrow morning for another session.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too. Bye.